Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Usama Makdisi, and I'm joined, as always, by my brothers Seri
Hello, everyone.
and Karim.
Hi, everyone.
And a special thanks, of course, to our producer, Sina Rahmani, who reminds me to tell all our listeners and our viewers to please subscribe, to like, and to give a 5-star review if and when you're able to on this platform or on any platform that you are watching or listening to this. Also, Sina reminds me to tell you that we started a Patreon recently and we're getting it up and running. So we encourage you, if you're so inclined, to please sign up and to subscribe. The link is going to be in the episode description below. We plan on posting bonus content there, and any support you can give to this podcast would be greatly appreciated. We're going to have full episodes that will be at some point behind a paywall, and Q&A with our patrons. So please take a look at that and help out. Today, we are truly delighted to have with us the amazing Dima Khalidi, who is a brilliant person and the founder and director of an extraordinary organization called Palestine Legal, that I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers are aware of, which has provided and continues to provide legal advice and advocacy to protect people, scholars, but not just scholars, students, speaking out for Palestinian freedom as part of its mission to bolster the Palestine solidarity movement by challenging what we see as an extraordinary increase in efforts to threaten, to harass, to legally bully activists and scholars into silence and inaction. Prior to founding Palestine Legal in 2012, Dima worked with the Center for Constitutional Rights as a cooperating attorney on the Mamilla Cemetery campaign, and before that she worked as a volunteer and as an Ella Baker intern at the CCR. Dima has a JD from DePaul University College of Law, an MA in International and Comparative Legal Studies from the University of London, SOAS, and a BA in History from the University of Michigan. And prior to studying law, Dima worked at Birzeit University on a research project on informal justice mechanisms in the Palestinian legal system. So Dima, welcome to Makdisi Street. It's really a delight for us to have you here. And we'd like to start off by asking you, maybe you can introduce yourself very briefly and tell us why you founded Palestine Legal in 2012.
Thanks, Usama, and it's really great to be with the three of you. This is an exciting chance to talk with three brilliant academics in this field. I am a Palestinian American. I grew up, both in Beirut and in the States, mainly in the States, and have always been exposed to Palestinian politics, and was in a household that encouraged political education, and have been politicized all my life, and wanted to go to law school in order to do something in furtherance of our Palestinian struggle. So, originally thought that international law was the route to go, but coming out of law school and thinking about the ways that I could contribute in the legal sphere, it became very clear the need for legal support for folks in the United States who are advocating for Palestinian rights, as we saw more and more repression and legal actions, in particular targeting a growing Palestine movement at the time, back in the 2010s, when the BDS movement was beginning to grow in the States, and more campuses were, student governments were voting to divest from companies, complicit in Israel's occupation. As we saw the student movement in particular growing and gaining influence on campuses. We saw the Irvine 11 case where students at University of Irvine, California, Irvine, were protesting an Israeli ambassador and were criminally prosecuted for it. Lawsuits against BDS campaigns and things like that. So, Palestine Legal really came out of that understanding that this was a great need here in the U.S. to really advocate for the protection of fundamental rights that allow social change to happen, and without ensuring that these fundamental constitutional freedoms are upheld and strengthened, we devolve into the kind of situation we're in today, really, where speaking out on issues of really important international and domestic concern is becoming taboo, is being criminalized, is being suppressed in a lot of different ways, which I'm sure we'll get into. And you look at every significant social justice movement of the past, and you see similar patterns, right? Where often it's young folks who are mobilizing, who are leading, who are really forcefully demanding change, and there is almost always some form of strong state and other repression, and eventually, hopefully we'll see the same in this case, but eventually there has to be some reckoning with the demands of these movements.
So, Dima, my brothers, of course, are going to jump in with questions as we go along. But I guess the most obvious question is right now, in the aftermath of October 7th and the extraordinary, when all of us are university professors, the three of us are university professors, but the extraordinary crackdown that we see all across this country is, how do you describe the current situation as opposed to the work you were doing and you guys were doing before October 7th, since you said Palestine Legal was founded in 2012. So in that decade prior, is it a quantum leap in terms of repression and censorship, or how would you describe the situation before and after October 7th?
Yeah, I think it's really important to put what's happening in that context. When Palestine Legal started in 2012, we launched in 2013, there was certainly consistent reports to us and generally of repression on campuses, as I mentioned, the Irvine 11 case and lawsuits by Israel advocacy groups. But over the last decade, we've seen just an exponential increase in the kind of repression. More and more, there have always been dozens of Zionist groups who are spearheading a lot of the suppression, but more and more we're seeing the state engaged in repressive activities. So over the last just since 2014, we've seen waves of legislation, for example, that is punishing or attempting to criminalize advocacy for Palestinian rights, BDS campaigns in particular, that is trying to codify a definition of anti-Semitism that is designed to encompass advocacy for Palestinian rights and anti-Zionism. So that has been a consistent, and what we saw in the last decade has been an exponential growth in the kind of repression, especially on campuses. Educational institutions have been a primary space where these kinds of debates are happening and where repression is focused. And so you have, we've seen over the last decade, also an increase in doxing of students, professors, as you all know, of disciplinary actions against students based on often bogus accusations and complaints against them. very personalized attacks often, right? The tactic is one of the major tactics is to target individuals, to make examples out of people, to try to scare people away from engaging because it's too costly for their careers or their reputations. So that has been a growing tactic. And we've also seen an increase in lawsuits. Um, uh, the lawsuit against the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights has went on for a few years before just ended this year, this fall. And they were accused of supposedly supporting terrorism because they tweeted about the Great March of Return in Gaza and fiscally sponsored the Boycott National Committee, and that case was dismissed. But the purpose of this kind of lawfare, as it's called, or these kinds of legal attacks, are to distract us from the goals of the movement, which are to advance, Palestinian rights here, to change U.S. policy away from unconditional support for Israel, to stop the unconditional, unfettered supply of military and financial and other aid to Israel, et cetera. It's to distract the movement from those goals and to drain our resources to defend, the basic speech and advocacy that folks are engaged in. So certainly, none of what we've seen since October 7th is new, but the scale is unbelievable, unimaginable. It does not spare any sector, any arena, from K through 12 schools to universities to tech companies to every employment situation you can think of, to government workers, to artists and intellectuals and writers and anything. We've had intakes from grannies who go to the casino and are kicked out because they're wearing a Free Palestine T-shirt. So the level of kind of McCarthyist purging that we're seeing in every conceivable arena is unprecedented for sure.
Dima, I don't think you're being fair to the other side. It's to cover for genocide is a lot of work. I mean, like you almost feel sorry for them. It's not easy to bend over backwards as they're doing and operate in overdrive 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to cover up for genocide, which is obviously exactly what they're doing. So there's a reason why all of their activity went nuts after October 7th. It's that because the aftermath has been this genocidal campaign of violence in Gaza, and yeah, they're desperate to cover it up by any means necessary.
Yeah, that's absolutely what's happening. The infrastructure for, the current onslaught has been built over the last couple of decades, and that has allowed them to go into overdrive in this moment where it is very clear that the majority of Americans, the majority of people of color and young people are see very clearly what's happening, that this is a genocide, that this is not about October 7th, that this is about 75 years of dispossession and occupation and oppression. That there is a fundamental that there's fundamental misinformation happening here, that you cannot trust Israeli officials, much less the mainstream media, and there is massive mobilization to not only for a ceasefire, but for really addressing the root causes of what's happening now. So absolutely, and so much of the repression we're seeing is based on gaslighting. I mean, it's projecting what Israel does and what Zionist groups do onto the Palestine movement, onto Palestinians, in a way that like if you have even the slightest understanding of the situation, becomes very clear. There are 30,000 plus people who have been killed, millions displaced. Uh, uh, we have every credible legal expert saying this is likely genocide. We have human rights agencies also building the case that this is fundamentally a state that engages in apartheid, that engages in war crimes, that engages in constant human rights violations, and all of the arguments, all of the attacks that we see are premised on denying these facts, right?
So but Dima, so this actually, to restate my other question more more seriously, I suppose, although I meant what I said before. Um, so there's two things happening. One thing is that it's especially with regard to what's happening in Gaza right now, it's so clear to so many people, despite the incredible distortion in the mainstream news media, which is not new, but it's obviously so many people can see right through all of the lies and the propaganda and the hasbara to see exactly what's going on. So it seems like they're trying to cover up. I mean, like the mission itself to try to obscure what's happening in Gaza is essentially mission impossible for all intents and purposes. But then the flip side, and I want you to think about that, but also the flip side, which is, I mean, you're the lawyer, not me, but it seems to me that what Zionist institutions in America are essentially trying to do is to prohibit free speech, which seems like, at least in an American context, that seems to be also mission impossible. So they have kind of two missions impossible. Yes, it's annoying and it's tiring, and obviously for an institution like your own, it's a lot of work to kind of, and maybe that's half the point of what they're trying to do, is just to make people work for nothing. But I mean, to work for the purpose, like for its own sake, in a way, to drain resources for nothing, not nothing, but you know what I mean, for the sake of it. But so, what do you think? Because it seems like, again, I defer to your expertise, but from the stories that I've followed, where they raise a legal case against, it's happened in the past, for example, UC Berkeley and other places too. They always get thrown out of court because basically they're trying to suppress free speech, which is essentially, well, I don't know if it's impossible, but it's difficult to do in an American context. So we have these, what seems to me, as just as an observer, a lay observer, obviously in this case, they seem to have two impossible missions. One is to suppress a reality that essentially everybody who cares to can see for themselves, and on the other hand, to suppress free speech in the United States, which is also mission impossible. Or am I wrong? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's only mission impossible if we have the institutions and the democratic kind of principles and the legal frameworks to make it impossible. And unfortunately, the moment we're in is seeing an erosion of all of those things, not just from uh, Zionist groups, but from the right wing generally, right? Where there has been a steady and alarming erosion of First Amendment rights. There has been an alarming and steady erosion of, name any other constitutional right other than the Second Amendment, right? And so I think the fact is that Zionist groups are taking advantage of that, and they have aligned themselves with, this right wing and increasingly fascist kind of what is a very slippery slope, right? If we're talking about Trump, if we're talking about the erosion of democracy and democratic institutions, that is something that Zionist groups are actively contributing to. So yes, we have a very strong First Amendment, stronger than in Europe and most other places in the world. And yet, if we are, constantly making exceptions and eroding those rights, we are heading towards a situation where First Amendment rights are not as strong, where the freedom of the press, doesn't mean much when media companies are owned by billionaires and controlled and influenced by political interests. I think the other piece here is that the um, the kind of legal tactics of a lot of these Zionist groups rely also on perverting anti-discrimination laws, right? And there is a tension between anti-discrimination laws and free speech. What Zionist groups are trying to do is to make Zionism an identity, a protected category like race and ethnicity and religion, and therefore make anti-Zionism not a matter of speech, but a matter of or political belief, right? But a matter of racism, that it should be addressed and falls under anti-discrimination laws and protections. There are really critical. This is a really critical moment for in legal terms when we're talking about the First Amendment and anti-discrimination laws and other arenas where like criminal law, right? If we're talking about, we've seen throughout over the last many decades since the 60s and before, attempts to use material support for terrorism laws to specifically target the Palestinian liberation movement, the advocacy for Palestinian rights in the U.S., and we're seeing a push to further expand those laws now to criminalize dissent, right, and to criminalize advocacy right now against genocide. So there are many legal arenas where this issue is a real test of the strength of constitutional principles, as it has been in the past. But it's a really, really critical moment.
Dima, I wanted to ask, because you've opened up a lot of sort of avenues for rich discussion that I want to come to, but even before this, the question of resources. I mean, before October 7th, and then you're describing how after October 7th is a lot more. It's a lot more intense in terms of the attacks on any Palestine solidarity, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, all of this. But what is it that, how do we compete against a movement or a set of people or a set of donors that basically have endless resources versus the side that's pushing for justice in Palestine or solidarity with Palestine, that frankly doesn't have, but has, I think, a lot of popular mobilization these days on campuses and outside. Now, I think increasing, and I think you can tell us more if my impression is true, that there's increased solidarity on campuses and outside, but not much resources, not by way of financial resources anyway. And these things, and lawyers and legal cases and those who have to dedicate a lot of time and effort. It's not 1 day or 2 days just okay, let's volunteer. It's a lot of work. I'm sure you'll describe that. But where do the resources come, and how does one compete with this, what seems to me to be an endless tap of money that comes in with all these shady organizations that just pop up out of nowhere, and suddenly you get attacked, or suddenly somebody else gets attacked. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it is a real, it reflects the power imbalance. It reflects the asymmetry of not just the situation here in the U.S., but on the ground in Palestine. Right, this is a state against a stateless people who are a large proportion of whom are refugees, and who have been kind of undermined for decades and decades, and suppressed and repressed and oppressed. The fact is that there has been over many, many decades a great buildup of resources in the established Jewish community in the U.S. And it has been increasingly, especially since 1967, Zionist, expressly Zionist institutions that are leading the way, right? And so, compared to the Palestinian American, the Arab American, the Muslim American communities that are, more recent immigrants that are, not as established in different ways, we're behind, right, in terms of building our political power, our economic power in the U.S. And I think it's part of it is reflective of that reality. And now you're seeing, first, new generations of Palestinian, Arab, Muslim Americans, and others, allied communities, immigrant communities, who kind of increasingly understand the political system, understand what it takes to affect change, to have some political voice and power. And I don't know that we can ever compete on a financial or even a political level, but what we do have are the numbers. And that is reflected in the streets, that is reflected on campuses, that is reflected in many arenas, where there is just clear and overwhelming support for Palestinian rights, and increasingly, just on a much larger level since October 7th, certainly. So I think there is, and we've seen this over the last decade, but especially in the last 4 months, in this really critical emergency crisis moment, those resources being mobilized in ways that, it would have been nice if we could have built this up over the last 10 months, but 10 years. But hey, it's these crisis moments that I think allow really get people to see how important it is for us to invest not just in humanitarian aid on the ground for people suffering, but in the kind of political power that is necessary to change those conditions, right?
Can you be more specific? Who's providing support? And what about all the rich Palestinians and Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans, for that matter, Muslim Americans, for that matter? I mean, where is the big kind of billionaire benefactor that can pump some money into this? Do they exist?
Let me know if you hear about them first.
I mean, it's not like there's a shortage of rich Arabs or rich Arab Americans, for that matter. They're out there somewhere.
Yeah, and I have seen, as we have grown Palestine Legal, that more and more of our community is seeing the importance of investing in this kind of work, investing in institutions here that are challenging the status quo, that are honestly, there is a lot of fear in our community too. After 9/11, after the kind of prosecutions that we saw targeting humanitarian organizations, and that has had a real chilling effect on our community, on the Muslim American community. But that doesn't stop folks, and I think people are beginning to see. We're seeing more and more young professionals stepping up, and there are very strong Palestinian American communities that are increasingly investing in this kind of work. And yeah, I mean, we have a lot of resources in our community, but it's not just coming from our communities either. There are a lot of people in Jewish communities and folks who understand the issue and want to support the movement for Palestinian rights, who are investing in organizations like Palestine Legal and other institutions that have come out over the last 10 years. And I think there is a process of establishing the credibility and showing that this is serious and there's serious work happening here, and in order to affect the change, we need to see we need to invest in and grow these efforts. But also just in terms of human resources, right? Just since October 7th, we've had well over 1,000 attorneys, stepping up and saying, "How can we help?" Right? We've had law students, and I know this is the case for other organizations as well in the media and otherwise. Artists and writers, really mobilizing their human resources to contribute and build up our capacities.
Well, Dima, that's sort of encouraging, that note that because at the beginning, it sounded like there was Palestine Legal and nobody else. And essentially you're fighting everybody, not fighting, you're advocating and you're defending everybody, and it's all on you and your organization. And that's why Karim's question, it sounds overwhelming, but your answer is that there's a change happening. So my question based on that is, on the Palestine Legal website, you have a very powerful description of the ethics of your organization, the background and the mission. And one of the things you say is that there's intersection between the struggle for Palestinian liberation and those of other groups and communities and peoples, indigenous, Black Americans, and on all the other communities who've been oppressed and peoples who've been oppressed in this country. And so, to what extent do you find that you're getting, or we're getting, support legally from those communities and people in those communities and others who see it as indeed an intersectional struggle? And on the other hand, how is this particular Palestinian case, given who the opposition is, the Zionists in America, and what you described earlier on our show, how is this case different from these other previous cases? In other words, is our situation, in a sense, I mean, how does it compare? Because people are coming in solidarity, but how do they compare?
How do they compare with other
legal cases? Yeah, and other movements. You said that other movements, that we're not the first people who've been subjected to this kind of repression. So how does our situation compare to these other things? I mean, we're in 2024 after all. We're not in the 1950s with the McCarthyist period. We're not in the 1920s or 30s. We're in the 21st century, and yet we're being subjected to something that's extraordinary, as you've described.
Yeah, and just to the previous point, we are definitely not alone. There are a number of organizations that have consistently and in a very principled way, done legal work around Palestinian rights issues, the Center for Constitutional Rights. We've seen ADC do a lot of work since October 7th around the repression. Organizations like CARE, are getting enormous amounts of intakes and are doing a lot of work and have done a lot of work around this issue. And other legal and advocacy organizations as well, of course. To your question, I think what we're seeing is not a spontaneous development in terms of kind of cross-movement, intersectional politics. Obviously, any kind of student of the 1960s and 70s knows that there's a historical connection between the Palestinian liberation movement and other movements, the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, the Chicano liberation movement, and I think we're seeing, from that time period where certain there was a kind of internationalism that defined some of the politics around these issues. I think we're seeing over the last couple of decades in particular, a kind of reemergence of that perspective, that an internationalist perspective, a left perspective, a view of this issue of Palestine and Palestinian rights as one tied to broader struggles for liberation against settler colonialism, against capital, the oppression of the global South, etc. And so there has been very concerted and consistent building, but among various social justice movements in the U.S. over the last couple of decades in particular. And it's very much a two-way street where we saw in Ferguson and in 2014 a very clear and dedicated solidarity by Palestinians with Black communities who are rising up against police violence, and connections, being the dots being connected between the kind of militarization of police and the racist policing and the kind of military industrial complex and Israel's role and the way that Israel treats and perceives Palestinians on the ground. So I think there has been a growth in this kind of cross-movement solidarity for a long time. You see the movement for Black Lives is very clear in its politics, its platform. Its Invest Divest platform says very clearly that they are for investing in communities and resources for our people here and divesting from the occupation of Palestine, divesting from the military-industrial complex, et cetera. These are deep and substantive and material relationships that have been formed and that have been built across movements. And same with Native American movements, and there is a lot of conversation and comparison and solidarity when we're talking about Standing Rock, right? You saw delegations of Palestinians going to Standing Rock and saying, "We understand this, and we stand with you against this encroachment on your lands and the dispossession of your people, because we experienced this too." And the repression of those movements, of the movement for Black Lives, of the Native American liberation movement, and of the environmental justice movement that has been fighting against pipelines and whatnot, is also very real and severe.
So Dima, when we look at institutions like the police or the prison system, of course, those are repressive institutions. But if we look at universities, those are meant to be enlightened and liberatory institutions. So the point is that it's difficult to imagine. I think it would be difficult to imagine a university suspending, a Black rights group these days in 2024. I'm talking, or a queer rights organization on campus, right? The organizations that, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, the organizations that are being suspended are typically, SJP is the number one example, which has been, it's what are they called? Not branches, but chapters have been suspended at various universities across the country. I guess primarily on the East Coast, really. But anyway, yeah, across the country, there've been suspensions of SJP. So, what do you make of the fact, first of all, that universities, when it comes to the Palestine exception, universities are doing this extraordinary policing of activism, student activism in particular, but also repression of faculty. We all know the many stories about faculty who've been fired or lost jobs or lost tenure, or had all kinds of problems because of speaking up for Palestinian rights. So it turns out that, at least on this question, universities manifest themselves as extraordinarily repressive places. And I suspect, but you could tell me if I'm wrong. I suspect that private universities are actually much worse in this regard than public universities. So, like for example, I was recently giving a talk at the University of Pennsylvania, and the atmosphere there is positively poisonous, as it is at places like Columbia and Harvard and Brown, places like that, which all of which are private, obviously, right? So it seems like there's something in particular about repression at private institutions that makes them seem, at least in this regard, much worse. Not that public universities don't have their issues, they do. Sam and I are both at public institutions, but not like they don't seem as bad as the private institutions we're also looking at. So what do you think about this question about the role of universities, which are supposed to be institutions of enlightenment, actually playing this incredibly repressive role when it comes to the policing of Palestinian rights and Palestinian advocacy and so forth?
But Sari, let me add, if there's Florida and public universities in Florida, I know there's a lot of legislation. I'm sure Dima knows that, but I'm not sure it's just private. I'm sure a lot of public as well.
No, I didn't mean to say it's just, but I mean, it seems on the whole, like, for example, yeah, go ahead, Dima.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to contextualize the question too in a couple of ways. One, historically, universities were sites of repression also, and when the student movements were really strong in the 60s and 70s, right? The anti-war movement and, the civil rights movement were all often centered on campuses, and you saw major repression from universities back then. So, in a way, since then there have been a lot of protections built in response to those times, and yet, as you said, there is and has been over the last couple of decades, in particular, what we call a Palestine exception on campuses and beyond, and I think that's there are a few things happening. One is there is a pattern with universities where we're seeing the increasing corporatization of universities. And that means increasing reliance on private donors, and as we see more and more, those donors have a huge amount of influence on universities, in particular private ones. And I think that the distinction you're drawing between private and public universities really is fundamentally about the fact that public universities are government institutions and are bound by the First Amendment. So, they have a responsibility, are mandated to respect the First Amendment.
Sorry, Dima, can you just for our speakers and those who are overseas also, can you just explain what the First Amendment is in terms of free speech and so on?
Yeah, the First Amendment protects speech from interference by government actors, right? So, if where universities are public entities, receive public funding, and university administrators are public officials, they are prohibited from interfering in the speech activities of their students and otherwise on campuses. And that's not unfettered, right? It doesn't mean that there are certain exceptions, there are certain ways that speech can be restricted, but it has to be viewpoint neutral. It can't say, oh, you can talk about Israel, but you can't talk about Palestine. It can say, nobody can, protest on any issue at these times and in these places, right? It has, so there are certain ways that that speech can still be restricted, but it can't be based on, the viewpoint that is being, or the content that is being aired. So, public universities have a particular responsibility, and they're prohibited from, discriminating against people on the basis of their viewpoint and their speech, and repressing speech activities. Whereas private universities have a lot more leeway. It's based more on their policies, their own free speech policies, which, at many liberal institutions, they say, they try to, um, hew those policies more closely to the First Amendment. But, what we've seen certainly since October 7th and before as well is that they are constantly changing those policies in response to, things that happen on campuses, in response to the protests that have been emerging. Um, and that is really problematic, and has resulted in a huge amount of student disciplinary hearings that we're dealing with, and others are dealing with, for for students protesting on campuses in different ways. And the reality of the moment, the severity of what's happening, the uh, um, the compulsion that students and others feel to do something right now to stop this unfolding genocide, means that the kinds of actions that students are taking, and others, in across the country are taking, are more and more in the realm of civil disobedience, sit-ins, and other actions that are calling out and trying to hold accountable their own institutions for complicity in what Israel is doing, and pushing for institutional change as well. So the reaction of universities has been very repressive. I think the other factor here is, that what I kind of alluded to before, the intersection of this issue with other attacks on liberal education, by the right wing. And so, yes, this is exceptional in a lot of ways, the ways that Palestine advocacy, scholarship, activism is being targeted, and it is very much in line with what we are increasingly seeing coming from the right wing, of attempts to ban books, of attempts to ban DEI initiatives on campuses, of attempts to, as DeSantis has done, kind of completely, reconstitute universities and boards to hew to right wing tendencies, and the kind of massive attack on so-called critical race theory, right? Where we see legislation that is trying to prevent teachers from teaching about race history and about LGBTQ issues. So a lot of what we're seeing is also in line with that, where you have Zionist groups saying you can't let teachers, or with the ethnic studies curriculum, you can't teach students about Palestinian rights or about the BDS movement. You can't teach, a class about settler colonialism on campus because that is, quote, anti-Semitic. The premise of these arguments is very similar to the kind of anti-CRT argument that teaching about race history makes white people uncomfortable, because they feel like they're responsible for this sordid history of slavery and segregation and oppression of Black people, right? And it's the same kind of argument. Like if you teach about Palestine, or if you teach about, if you question the Zionism or the state of Israel, then you are harming Jewish students, right? Who hold this belief, or have this connection. So I think it's important to link it to that, to that broader, kind of this broader political moment we're in, where there is a very concerted effort to undermine liberal education institutions, and the result of that is undermining academic freedom. It's undermining First Amendment rights, It's I think Palestine is at the forefront of that right now, where there are very clear efforts to purge individuals from institutions because of their political beliefs and to punish people in this way.
On that very point that you raised right now about the weaponization of feelings, which is you mentioned it in terms of the in Florida, what's going on in Florida in terms of repressing critical race theory because it makes people feel uncomfortable and so on, and that's exactly the same kind of approach that we see on campuses all across this country, and I'm sure you've come across as well. So my question is that a legal argument that's being advanced, or is that a legislative argument that they're using to shut down? And what is the difference between those 2 points? Because it seems absurd.
Or is it a nonsense argument?
Well, of course, but it's of course because it's all about trying to prevent us from teaching and preventing our students from learning, obviously. And so you can't teach about Zionism because Zionism makes people feel, they're part of their identity, so to speak. And therefore, if you criticize Zionism, as you said at the beginning, you're criticizing one's identity. So it becomes about discrimination rather than about education and enlightenment. And so I guess I'm asking, is it a legal issue or is it a legislative issue in terms of how you're dealing with this, or how it's unfolding on campuses across this country, this business of the weaponization of feelings?
Well, I think it's both, and and campuses are their own kind of entity environment as well. But we're seeing legislation being weaponized to undermine what are constitutional rights and legal principles, and that kind of legislative action or executive action is being challenged in courts, on First Amendment grounds, on other legal grounds. We sued the University of Florida after DeSantis ordered public Florida universities to deactivate Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, arguing that this is fundamentally a violation of the First Amendment, as the Supreme Court has said before when universities tried to ban SDS chapters in the 60s. And the court said very clearly, this is a First Amendment right to associate and a free speech. The court dismissed our lawsuit, but was very clear that any attempt of Florida universities to actually go forward with a deactivation would be a violation of the First Amendment, and that would be a reason to go back to court, right? So the judge basically ruled that it was very unlikely that this was going to happen because they know it's illegal, right? So we're seeing these kinds of legislative efforts, initiatives being challenged. The anti-CRT laws have been challenged by ACLU and other groups. We've seen anti-boycott laws challenged consistently, and I think that there are very strong First Amendment and other legal arguments to make against these kinds of initiatives. And what we have to do as well is it's a political fight, right? As much as it is a legal one. We are in a place where our state legislatures are, without debate, passing these kinds of laws. And what does that say about the electorate and how we're holding our elected officials accountable? And for university institutions, right? Again, there is so much of what's happening is a result of political pressure. It's a result of pressure not only from donors and trustees, but from a whole slew of Zionist groups that are engaging in extensive pressure campaigns against universities, as well as government agencies, right? So one of the arenas of this issue is the Department of Education and the Office for Civil Rights there, where there is a huge amount of pressure from the White House, from Zionist groups to recognize that anti-Semitism is a problem, and this has resulted in these kind of McCarthyist, congressional hearings with university presidents, right? Are you or are you not? That is another huge factor here. That the law, there are attempts um, to twist the law and twist anti-discrimination law in particular to suppress what is essentially speech on a political issue.
So on that note, Dima, in terms of the first of all, the question is, to the best of your knowledge, is this weaponization of feelings a new tactic that's developed in the last few years, starting in Florida and then going on to other places? I mean, we see it all across this country now. Did it happen in the 60s and 50s, to the best of your knowledge? That's one question. And the second question is, in terms of law schools, since you mentioned law schools earlier, I'm wondering, were law schools in the 60s, for example, at the forefront of I mean, I don't know. This is a question I honestly don't know. And I don't know if you know, but were they at the forefront of, in terms of legal scholars in law schools, professors of law fighting for civil rights? Because we know many of these famous people who fought for civil rights coming out of law schools across this country, as opposed to today. Our law schools today, I mean, I know there are a lot of students who are activists in law schools, but I'm talking about professors in general. Do you have a sense of where they stand on this issue?
Yeah. I think that the politics of feeling is relatively new, honestly. It is, I think it comes out of a kind of liberal identity politics in a way, and it is a kind of replacement of identity and how you identify and how you feel for politics, and there is a lot of criticism of this kind of politics, and I think it has resulted in kind of pretty empty um you, you know it, frankly, like things like DEI initiatives, which are not looking at identity as a kind of a separate thing from politics, and that's in my mind often not very helpful. But this, I think if you look at the 60s and 70s, it was very much a principled political struggle, and it was ideological, right? And that was recognized. There were ideological differences within movements, and now you're seeing less of that and more of this is we represent all of these people, right? Where one person can speak for an entire community, and I think that's dangerous. And like there's been a lot of emphasis on creating safe spaces and creating places where people are can be who they are. I think there is a huge benefit to that, where you see the way that marginalized communities have benefited from having those kinds of spaces, and at the same time that has been twisted as well, right? Where that becomes exclusionary, right? Versus creating kind of an opportunities that folks haven't had before, right? And I think the weaponization of that kind of thing is also very dangerous. So there is this inability to contextualize these phenomena, right? in the kind of power analysis that is necessary to understand why it is that Black people might need a safe space, or Palestinian people might need a safe space, or trans people, LGBTQ people might need a safe space, and why their feelings do matter, right? And it's, I think, in my mind, it's very similar to the reaction of to Black Lives Matter, to say, oh well, no, all lives matter. And that completely decontextualizes the whole movement, right? Which is saying, up until now, Black lives have not mattered, and that's why they're policed, and that's why they're disenfranchised, and that's why um, and I think that's a dangerous path as well.
Dima, one place where a lot of these issues that you're talking about came together, you touched on it briefly in passing a few minutes ago, was those extraordinary congressional hearings in the fall with the three university presidents summoned. So, to me, anyway, again, as a layperson, it seems to me that that's kind of unprecedented to summon the presidents of three major private universities and then grill them as they did for hours and hours and hours in Congress on basically sham things. Like, the slogan they kept being asked about, nobody actually said. Nobody was calling for a Jewish what's it called, Jewish genocide, which is what Elise Stefanik and others kept saying. Would you denounce it? But the question I want to ask you is, um, if you were one of those university presidents, because I think at least one of them, maybe even two of them, had a background in law. But what would you have What would you have said? What would be, or if you were advising them, what would the appropriate response for the president of a private university being summoned to account for herself in the U.S. House of Representatives about issues happening on campus? What would the appropriate response be for a university president under those circumstances? I mean, a lot of things come to mind for me if I were there, but I'm not a lawyer and I don't know what the legal ramifications are. But what would you, if you were there, what would you have said to these congressional inquisitors trying to say there should be political oversight over effectively, that's what they were saying, is that there should be political oversight over our universities. What would you say if you had been there?
Well, I think what a lawyer would advise and what I would say might be different. I think there's one of the, I think, mistakes that a lot of universities have made, is to make statements that are responsive to political pressure, and it probably would have been much more effective to take a stance that says, we are an institution of education, that our mission is to allow our community to engage in intellectual debate, and that's what's happening on campus. And I think there also has to be a very clear denunciation of the kind of efforts to um, y- you know misidentify, misinform, give factually incorrect statements. Right? We have to challenge the notion that that uh, um, what happened on October 7th is so-called genocide, or that River to the Sea is a genocidal statement, or those are the arguments, and that's where the Inquisition is coming from. It's coming directly from Israel and Israel advocacy groups that are making these claims. And in my mind, if you can't challenge that at an educational institution, where can you have these conversations about what is actually happening, and and it allows students to engage in um, political activity, as historically has been the case on campuses. So I think it's important to really bring forth the mission and the historical relevance of campuses in these moments of political upheaval and crisis. and ensure that there are spaces where these conversations can happen, instead of spaces where such conversation and activity is repressed.
So, Dima, on that note, I guess we're going to wrap. And thank you so very much for your time and for your wisdom, for explaining to us the situation, the legal sort of landscape across this country right now. And honestly, all we can say is keep up the great work. And we're going to link, of course, to Palestine Legal. But all our listeners and viewers, I'm sure, are aware of Palestine Legal and the work that you've done and the work that all your staff is doing in these incredible, sort of really difficult times, I'm sure, for you as for us. So thank you again, Dima, for joining us on Makdisi Street, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you, Dima.
I'll appreciate you so much, and all you're doing as well on the intellectual and advocacy front. We need all of you so much.
Thanks, Dima.
Thank you, Dima.
Great to see you.
Okay, guys, that was a great session with Dima Khalidi. Really an incredible person doing extraordinary work. And what did you guys think about that in terms of, on the one hand, a history of legal sort of repression and fighting back for justice in different cases, and then the Palestine exception, as she said?
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. The convergence of political factors that have led to, that's led to where we are now with the legalized war on the expression of Palestinian rights. But as we've said in many different contexts, this is a sign of desperation. I mean, it came up in our discussion with Dima. Basically, these institutions are they're doing, it's essentially mission impossible. They're trying to cover up a genocide that everybody can see for what it is. And so it doesn't make, that doesn't make our lives any easier necessarily, but it does speak to the depths of desperation to which Zionist institutions now have to resort, at least in an American context. It's desperate. They're just trying to suppress everything. And I think it's impossible for them to do, although, they continue to try to do so.
But I think the question is, it's going beyond the question of just justifying or defending Zionism or genocide in Gaza today, but it's at the risk of potentially destroying the kind of liberal system that supposedly exists in the U.S. and at U.S. universities. That is, as you were asking several times in that thing, whether it's private or public. So it's interesting that Dima was saying in terms of the Palestine exception, how they're trying to find ways to get around the First Amendment, which is the main obstacle, this idea of the First Amendment, by talking about, as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understood it, talking about Zionism becomes an emotional issue, so therefore an identity issue, therefore something that they can say you're discriminating against me if you're being anti-Zionist, or if you say anything that's anti-Zionist, as opposed to this is a free speech kind of thing, so I can say what I want. This is what I understood from it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's one tactic. That's
which is a big way, given that allows especially the right wing to be able, this obsession with the First Amendment. So it allows them to get over that, and it also allows the liberals to kind of continue to stick their heads in the sand and just like
Yeah, but that's the amazing thing, Karim. This thing about liberals sticking their heads in the sand, hoping that, oh, this is just going to affect Palestinians. Again, many of us have said this in different contexts. What we're seeing now is a convergence which has been developing for some time between Zionism and the far right in America and in Europe for that matter too. But we're talking about an American context here, right? Where they've long since had that relationship is an old, long-standing one. Zionist institutions like the ADL and others are willing to overlook the actual anti-Semitism of right-wing American zealots in order to forge, like, for example, the far-out Christian, so-called Christian, I don't think they're Christian, but so-called Christian, fundamentalist Zionists, who are anti-Semites, like real, like, old school anti-Semites, almost all of them in one way or another. But they're willing to forge an alliance with them in order to safeguard, Holy Mother Israel, basically between the and so what we're seeing now is a kind of alliance between Zionist academic, in this case, we're talking about academic repression mostly, Zionist academic repression, which is not new. They've been doing it for years, as Dima has said. As we've said in other contexts, I think talking about somebody else, another guest we had, there are 32 separate Zionist institutions that are banded together to form the Israel on Campus Coalition. That's an extraordinary.
It's,
like that there are
it's
that
beyond
many of these
just the
institutions.
Canary Mission and all this.
Yeah,
The old
it's like,
Campus Watch.
No,
These are like
well,
amateurs.
that's only one. Yeah, exactly. Those are and those are also like Canary Mission is like Johnny come lately to this party. You know, they're the but sorry, just to complete this thought, then you guys come in. But they've allied with is the hard right, the anti-DEI, the anti-critical race theory. Like this what we're seeing here is a critical convergence. And so liberal academics who think they could just put their heads in the sand and hope that this goes away and that maybe they'll take down, Palestine, the people who advocate for Palestinian rights, people who criticize Israeli genocide. But once they're done with us, they're going to come for you. The people should make no mistake about that. And Zionist institutions are willing, stand ready. They are willing to burn the American academic system to the ground. And they will do it if that's what it takes to protect Israel. And anybody connected to an academic institution should be very, very aware of that fact.
There's also the fact that there's a whole history of repression, and this is something we didn't have a chance to talk to Dima about, but the whole system of repression in Europe, of course, that's happening. That's even more flagrant because there is no First Amendment there as such. And then, Karim, the question, of course, for those of us or those of you who work in American institutions overseas, what's the impact of these kinds of debates and this kind of extraordinary levels of censorship that we see on American campuses today? How do they affect American institutions overseas? Because ultimately there is a relationship between these institutions, especially at the federal level, the government level, the Treasury Department, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I hope our
but these are
yeah.
by the way, these are I mean, they're very important issues, and they're questions on campuses at American universities abroad. You have to deal with things like the OFAC, the Treasury, that vet, and so that every single speaker that comes to the university, every faculty hire, all of these, anybody that comes in, if anybody that even registers to come to a lecture in the public, has to go through a vetting system now, which is done online, and has to pass through. And you have to get, if you're a speaker, I have to get your passport. You have to be submitted. You have to be cleared before I can invite you onto campus. So these are things that come directly out of the Treasury, and that these universities have to kind of comply with. And that's something which becomes very serious. And I'm not sure that's part of Palestine Legal. And it's not necessarily directed on Palestine issues, but on the larger geopolitics, the geopolitics around the Palestine issue, as you might imagine what they are. And then the other part of that is the question of which we didn't get to, is the question of criminalization of charities. So if you want to give some money to some child to help some children in Gaza today, people are scared to donate or to give, because you don't know what charities are banned, or what charities will be monitored, or what charities will put you on some kind of list that you'll never get out of. And so the kind of criminalization of charities and this vetting processes outside are things that I think impact outside of the US itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are all issues that we're going to continue talking about going forward. We should maybe say that our next...
Just one last issue sorry, someone to interrupt, but I think because we talked about it off camera, and it's worth just putting in, and maybe we should have some kind of episode on this later, the idea of Biden and Trump. And sort of off camera, it seems clear that, I mean, I personally can't stand Biden, and I think many of us can't, and he's called Genocide Joe for a reason. But the idea of within the US that the Democrats being in power as opposed to these Republicans will make a very big difference to the kind of domestic American scene, including what Palestine Legal and all of these different groups have to go through. That's my impression, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely worth a discussion, absolutely worth having, and it's a real debate that people having precisely for the reasons you just outlined. I mean, there's a guy who's committing genocide, enabling genocide, and then there's a specter of a narcissist, taking his place, who's not necessarily going to be better. But frankly, let's discuss that when we get to that point. I think we need to wrap at this point and just say again that we are looking forward to hosting soon Hanan Ashrawi, if we can finalize that, and many other guests in the pipeline. And again, a reminder to all our viewers and our listeners that we are starting a Patreon subscription. So if you want to help us out and help get the show or keep the show going, we would greatly appreciate it, as well as, of course, 5-star reviews. Seti and Karim, thank you.
Please send us feedback.
Of course, feedback and questions, above all questions, so that we can, if you have questions, you can always reach out to us on the Makdisi Street podcast feed. So do send us questions, and we hope to engage with these very soon. Thank you, brothers. Thank you.
And just to say on the Patreon, that will be one of the features. Would be a monthly episode where the three of us will answer questions from that our audience wants us to discuss, and of course, people can propose topics for shows and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Seti, and thank you, Karim, and thank you to Sina, our producer.
Thanks.
Thank you.